All right. Thank you very much I have here with me Jannie Venter, who's heading up the research committee, amongst other things, within the Actuarial Society. So he heads up our research efforts. We've got Marjorie Ngwenya, who plays many roles in the broader society. But one of the key roles that she played was that she was the president of the IFOA, the Institute of Faculty of Actuaries. And in that capacity, she was exposed to how various and very different actuaries from different continents and countries think. And therefore, we have brought her into this discussion. I'm Lusani, I'm the president of the Actuarial Society 2020-2021. So I am the Zoom president. I think Marjorie was the jet lag president when she was the IFOA president. I'm the Zoom president. But I'm also the public interest actuary. And this is the efforts of the Actuarial Society into the public policy space, the public sector space. So I've been appointed to lead that effort. Part of that is doing research and building relationships with public sector stakeholders. And then I've got some experiences to share, and some of them I'll write a book about sometime in the future. So we, as the Actuarial Society of South Africa, we had very interesting discussions, especially last year with the COVID-19 pandemic and just the responses, the public policy responses to that by government and also by the public. How do they engage in the debate? How do they respond to what governments are doing? Civil society, that is, and also the Actuarial Society as a professional body. How the Actuarial Society responded, and I mean, different actuarial bodies around the world responded in different ways, but how we responded primarily in the beginning was through the modeling exercise that we got involved in and sharing of that, the outputs of that. And we were all learning, as was everybody else around the world, learning how to model this thing that they had never encountered, but obviously based on similar epidemics in the past, but there were nuances to this one. That was one way of getting involved, and there are various ways. And there are individuals, even within the profession, that got involved in a different way, in a way to highlight that this particular public policy response may not be the most suitable one, and we can show you, or we can try to prove to you why we think this is not the most suitable one. So that was a different approach. It was not the kind of approach that we had taken as the Actuarial Society, but it was definitely a very useful angle. And I mean, Marjorie later on would also share from her, where she was sitting, how she saw other actuarial societies or actuarial bodies around the world, how they engaged in this topic. I know from what I looked at, that some got together into groups, looked at different papers that were being produced around the world, and asked or dealt with questions more related either to insurance or things that are closer to how it impacts their working environment, etc. So there were different ways of approaching this. But that was one sort of issue that got us to think more about this, because what we found is that other than just the way in which people engaged in the topic, there was also just, one could sense that there were ideological differences in how people engaged or how people responded as well. Perhaps not as much within the Actuarial Society, but clearly when you go into the broader society, there were those ideological issues. Then, it leads to the question, as actuaries, are we fully aware of the ideological underpinnings to the work that we do? do we sort of think that we are, that there isn't any ideological underpinning, that it's basically, it can be anything, or are we aware that there is? And also, if we were to move into an environment that is maybe has a different ideological framework, would we easily be able to recognize that and be able to still offer or render services that are relevant to those stakeholders? And so, we began to think about these kind of questions. We recognize as the Council of the Actuarial Society that we may not have answers to some of these. So, it's worth for us just to talk about it. There's a gentleman in the actuarial, in our profession, in the Actuarial Society, Andrew Warren, who then, introduced this idea of, let's talk about these things and let's be more fully aware of sort of ideological underpinnings, or the frameworks, or the ideologies that actually influence us in terms of the way that we think. And I think it's useful to recognize, if we think of the actuarial profession, and especially the one in South Africa, is very much influenced by the UK profession. Many of us were trained under that system, and that in itself has assumes a sort of a particular economic system, and the way one views things, and the way one approaches risk and the management of risk, etc. And then there's obviously, it's reasonable that many trained under the system would assume that is the framework, that is the ideological framework into many the kind of problems or work opportunities that we get involved in. But it's important also just to get that challenge. And then also the experience that was shared by some of the more experienced actuaries that we engaged with in the Actuarial Society, where what they experienced when they were involved in the public sector, with unions, for instance, where they would be challenged to the effect that maybe they've got a blinkered approach to things. They seem to get closed when they're considering certain things. And we probably, as a profession, wouldn't want to be seen as people who are blinkered. And therefore, it's important for us to have a discussion. So we've got you, Jannie, and Marjorie, for us to say, look, let's unpack this and share it with the members, and let's hear what members say about this. So, Jannie, what's your take on this?
Yeah, thanks, Lusani. And yeah, I think we've had, I thought, very good discussions about this. And for me, the point that really hit home is the one where we sort of realized that a similar problem with a similar set of circumstances may lead to different advice depending on who your stakeholder is. And we've, I think, grown up and developed our profession with a particular stakeholder in mind, particularly the proprietary owner kind of stakeholder. But I think your and reflections on it, I think, also demonstrated that perhaps that approach isn't the only approach. Now, if I think about the actuarial profession, I first and foremost think about us as fundamental thinkers. I think we have got this ability to go down to first principles and identify the main drivers of a particular situation, to cut through the complexity of a given situation and distill which are the main factors to consider and the interrelationship and the interaction of these factors. And it is it's a skill that I think we bring to the table, and it's often recognized and appreciated as a skill. And I think it will serve us well to remind to remember that this is really what we are at the heart of our profession. So I think where it leads one to is to say, well, how do you keep on adopting that kind of mindset? And and stay true to it as professionals. And what do we need to take care of as members of the actuarial society to make sure that we do create that environment where we say, yeah, we need to continuously adapt our methods of thinking, our way of assessing a problem, be open to new ideas, to different ways of thinking. Because that is really, I think, as you said a bit earlier, there was a time at the beginning of our profession where we didn't have, established ways of thinking. And clearly the ability to think in this particular way was appreciated. And we all today benefiting from that early work that was done and figuring things out. And I think we have a responsibility to continue to do that. So there's that. So on the one hand, you have this need to explore and be open to new ideas. But then on the other hand, we also have the existing profession. And we have a foundation that has been built and a reputation that has been built based on the work and the deep analysis and thinking that's been done over years and decades. And we have a reputation that has been built on top of that foundation to say, well, when you talk to an actuary, you can expect a certain outcome in a way because these methods have been proven. They've stood the test of time, and we've added value to people, to organizations over many years. So on the one hand, you want to protect what you've built and the methods and the methodology and the way of thinking. And on the other hand, you also want to progress and maybe even break down some of those ideas or alter them and change them, And these two don't always sit well together, reflecting a little bit on the conversations that we've had over the last year within the profession, I think it's one where it was that clash of ideas or ideals, perhaps, that has been surfaced, and we need to be able to manage that well within our profession and recognize, I think, the importance of both aspects, and find a way, to bring them both into the fold.
So, in other words, don't waste a good crisis. There's a lot to learn, and yeah. So, Marjorie, I know you've got a view on this, so I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Thanks, Lusani. So, very much aligned with what Jannie has shared. I believe that talking about mindset is critical here. Our ability to adapt, our willingness to adapt, our willingness to see things in different ways from those that have been established as our environments evolve, as our ways of doing things evolves, as we're hit with fresh crises and have to reinvent ourselves on the spot. So I think that we're known for having these domain specialisms. If you ask someone on the street, what does an actuary do? Most people will probably tell you about pensions or insurance. So we have this association and this deep respect, perhaps, in those areas. But what we have at the core are these skills that translate more broadly. For example, the ability to see the big picture and to see the linkages that contribute to a system. And that skill is very valuable in any industry, I believe. Our ability to be able to think about long-term problems and the consequences of various things that are complex and work together, but are not so easy for people who are not trained in that way of thinking or who don't have those skill sets to appreciate. And therefore, our job is to be able to simplify that kind of complexity. I don't think that gets old, really. So that's something we can continue to rely on. I think that we have to appreciate that while we are highly skilled and highly trained professionals, we do not have a monopoly on intellect, and we do not have a monopoly on approaches. So our ability to distinguish or to separate our skills from our qualification, I think, will be valuable. when we go into spaces where we're trying to showcase our skills or to sell ourselves, we should be talking less about we're actuaries and more about the value that we can add. And I think in this regard, appreciating how our skills complement the skills of other professionals, being able to collaborate, being able to learn from them, being able to present ourselves as teams that bring different things rather than actuaries with specific skills, for me would go a lot further. And so I think we have to ask ourselves, do we perhaps have a more intimate take on our profession's reputation and perhaps a more inflated view of our profession's reputation than actually exists out there? And go into these new spaces, so a public sector environment where many of our stakeholders have probably never heard of actuaries, and go in there with humility and explain who we are, what it is that we could do, but also have an appreciation and understanding of the context in which they operate, many of which we will not have a close understanding of.